It's nice to meet you, Nick.
Nice to meet you too. And you pronounce your name Shiva Ghaed, right?
Yep. Most of my patients just call me Dr. G
Dr. G.
because the last name has such a weird spelling. I should say a foreign spelling.
Sure. Something people aren't used to. Well, yeah, I'm excited for this. I appreciate that you're willing to open up about it. You said you were willing to talk about anything, and I appreciate that.
You can ask me anything. Well, I have to practice what I preach, right? And I preach to my patients that no secrets and don't hold back. So I absolutely cannot do that.
Love it.
Myself.
You do not avoid. You do not avoid.
I do not avoid. I do not avoid.
Yeah.
So how did you found just, how did you find me anyway?
I think actually, I think it was after another shooting that happened sometime since 2017. And I was kind of seeking out someone who specializes and understands this. And you, of course, have a very unique understanding, firsthand and theoretical. So, yeah. I mean, how uniquely equipped you are to talk about this.
I like to think so. I mean, I think we're all growing as therapists and constantly learning, but I know it definitely impacted the way that I teach my patients in some ways.
So I noticed you have this kind of orientation toward therapy, and you've even used the word psychoeducation, and just now you saying the phrase teach my patients. I like that about you. I like that flavor. I think therapy should be educational.
It has to be, actually. The field of psychology has changed quite a bit in the past century. And I mean, really, psychology, I would say, became kind of more popular probably in the middle of the last century. But this idea of you come in and lay down on a couch, and people make jokes about it now, but it's the psychodynamic, it's there. Some people come from that orientation, but I think slowly that sort of approach is phasing out, and it's being replaced by a much more active and very present-oriented therapy. We know that to help people change, we actually have to give them a foundation of change. And the way I like to put it with my patients is that we're teaching them a new vocabulary. And with this new vocabulary, they have to learn a whole bunch of new words, because we're trying to actually change the way that they think and the way that they process information, with the ultimate goal of having an alternative experience in their day, as it relates to themselves, the world, other people. So you can't really come into a therapy like that or a treatment program without orienting people. And so I always start off all kinds of therapy for all kinds of reasons with just basic education. Here are some words that I want you to learn. Here are some concepts I want you to learn. And here's some science that I want to teach you. I'm a big nerd, and I love to nerd out, and my patients know it, and they laugh about it. But I'll actually get them up on the whiteboard. I'll get up on the whiteboard, old school style, and I'll just outline all the structures in the brain. And, for example, when we're having a fight, flight, freeze response, what is happening down to the neurochemical and the structure in the brain. And something amazing happens when you educate people, whether patient, client, or just layperson. The thing that happens is suddenly they feel like mental illness is a real physical issue, and it destigmatizes it. I've had people leave my therapy room crying out of joy, saying things like, so it's not all in my head. It's not, well, and I'm like, well, actually everything's in our head, right? Whether you're tired, you're cold, you're in love, you're hungry, it's all happening up here. Our stomach's not talking to us. Our lips aren't talking to us. They're sending signals, but it's really important for them to understand that the brain is an organ and it functions like every other organ, but Side note, it's the most important organ because it actually runs the whole show. It runs all the other organs. And when we start to see a decompensation, a neurochemical change in the brain, and we start to notice psychiatric distress, psychological symptoms, what happens is it affects every other part of our body. We start to lose sleep. And then once we have sleep problems, it impacts your cardiovascular system, your immune system, your metabolic system, and your ability to manage pain. So there's just this snowball effect. So when people think that mental illness is just in your head, I mean, it's really absurd. And so one of my just missions in life is to help teach people to think about this new perspective of wait, the brain is an organ and we have to treat it like an organ. An example I give, Nick, is that nobody goes into the cardiology department and negotiates treatment. If the doctor says you need a stent or you need to take this medication for your blood pressure or whatever, people aren't like, no. Actually, yeah, I'll take it like 2 times a week, and yeah, I'm not willing to do that, and I'm not going to get the stent. I mean, people take it seriously. But why is it any different for the brain? And I'll tell you, I have folks coming in, they're like, doc, nope, sorry, I don't do groups. Treatment, I don't know. I don't know if I want weekly appointments. And then sometimes they're just not able or willing to do the homework. It's like, these are our tools. These are our medicines, right? And studies have shown that when you are on medication alone, you might have like a 50% improvement. If you're in therapy alone, another 50% improvement. When you put it together, we almost see a 2-fold improvement. So there's something synergistic when you put the two together. So, I just encourage people to come from a perspective of being psychologically minded and intelligently able to speak about brain health, right? Brain dis-ease is no different than any other dis-ease of any other organ system. So education is a really, really fundamental part of everything I do with patients, whether I'm educating them about sleep or educating them about medications. I'm the hugs doc, not the drugs doc, right? I kind of left the dark side. And decided like it. But and so I have nothing to gain one way or the other than the improvement of my patients. But I try to explain the physiology and the way that medications work and how they impact the brain, so that I can maybe encourage them to adhere to the recommendations that their psychiatrists make for them or their primary care doctors. So education is just critical. I mean, I don't think you can do really good work with people without educating. And I think just in general, the general population, knowing the why and the how helps you then decide, make an informed decision about what you're willing to do or not.
Knowing the why and the how, yes. We're just going to keep going here. And so, yes, I'm here with Dr. Shiva Ghaed, who's a clinical psychologist, still based in San Diego, right?
I am. I'm licensed in California and nationally board certified, but based here in San Diego.
Yes. And we're here to talk about a variety of things, including your personal experience surviving the Route 91 mass shooting, and then your understanding of how to heal and the way that you've gone through your own healing process and helped other people heal and established a community of survivors. It's a really beautiful story, and I'm grateful that you're here to tell it. I'll just share a few thoughts on everything you were just sharing. It's really interesting, because I think there have been many false theories about what is malfunctioning in the brain that have turned some people off to any explanation that is neurological for why a person's experiencing what they're experiencing. I mean, when you look far back enough, we had ridiculous things, that like toxins were being stored in organs, and so we need to perform organ removal to take the toxins out, and just totally wrong things. And And I think in many cases, even the chemical imbalance narrative is not what's really going on, or we haven't confirmed that that's what's going on yet. For everything psychological, there is something biological, and there will always be neurological correlates going on in the brain. And I like what you said about the way it destigmatizes a person's condition when they think of it in biological terms. And along with that, I think or part of that is that it makes them feel like it's not their fault also.
That's right.
So
That's right. That's an excellent point.
I think that's really helpful. And then just a comment on therapy and education. It's interesting because I come from the perspective of being a professor, and I've definitely noticed how therapeutic education can be. And then you're coming from the perspective of understanding how educational therapy can be. It's beautiful, and we kind of
100%. I love that I mean, I think we're kindred spirits in this sense. And obviously you're a professor. I teach, even though I'm not formally a professor. Most of my patients will say, yeah, it feels like I'm in a college class or maybe a graduate level class. And I think the important part of that is that, traditionally there's been this rift, this distinction between the patient and the doctor. And it's almost as though the information and knowledge about medicine is proprietary, and a patient wouldn't understand. And I have patients that that give this feedback, that say, nobody's ever taught me this, nobody's ever explained this to me. Some of it is that, let's face it, we're all overstretched. There's a huge shortage in mental health providers in this country, and we're in the midst of a mental health crisis. But once you teach people, they also feel empowered by this knowledge, and they feel confident in their ability to make changes, because when you really break things down, they start to recognize just how much of their improvement lies in their own control, in their own hands. If you think about it, the stigma that we've been fighting for a century probably, it really just comes from fear. And if you think about, well, where does fear come from? Fear comes from ignorance, right? And ignorance, some people might think that's an insult. It's not. It's just a word saying lack of knowledge, right? Stating lack of knowledge. There is a lack of knowledge. Some of that is that this is not universally taught, and it's not spoken of. And so that just perpetuates that secrecy and that shame and that guilt, and all of these myths and misconceptions and misunderstandings are perpetuating the stigma. But there's also truly a lack of knowledge. I mean, psychology and psychiatry are fairly new fields. I mean, they have their roots, in over a century ago, right? I mean, Aristotle's and Socrates,
right.
Even our Socratic questioning method, it goes way back. But the truth is, the brain is a scary organ because it does so much, and we don't understand most of it. I mean, I would say probably in terms of the science of that organ, we're probably in, infant stages. And who knows, in another 100 years, if we're all still here. I mean, we won't be, but, who knows what the understanding of the brain will be. But definitely that fear comes from ignorance. And so I feel that that's one way that we can, first of all, help people understand it's not their fault. But it is their responsibility to take care of their brain, just like it is their responsibility to take care of other parts of their health. So I could not agree more.
Beautiful. Well, I feel that I should kind of prepare the audience for what might be a very intense story. I can say that, well, let me just emphasize that you wrote the book, Route 91, Healing from Mass Violence and Trauma. And you just gave us all a gift by making it available for free online to download. So thank you for that. And reading it, the first chapter or two where you talked about what happened, was the most, let me say, the strongest vicarious experience I've had of that incident, and I've listened to people tell their story, and I've seen some footage and done my best to imagine, but reading your first person point of view brought me into it on another level. So, and it was really intense, but an extremely important story to hear. And then, so however comfortable you are in this moment to open up about what happened, please feel free to share with us.
I so appreciate that, and I'm very touched that you took the time to read the book. You know, it's a pretty easy 100-page read. It was intended as a teaching tool and as a starting point for people who may feel stigmatized and who also may not understand all of their symptoms. Let's face it, with social media and Google and all of these search engines, there is a plethora, an abundance of resources and information. However, having said that, not all of the information is actually helpful. And so, you know, having a specialization in trauma and anxiety disorders, which also then includes mood and everything that kind of hangs with that, it was really important to me to try to reach as many people as quickly as possible with at least tip of the iceberg, you know, introductory ideas, so they can understand their symptoms if they were having some, to understand the mechanism by which trauma develops and the path of healing, which is within reach for everybody, right, who is willing to listen and willing to learn. But it really was intended as a tool. I appreciate hearing from you that reading my account was helpful. At least there was enough there to put you at the shooting. The interesting backstory with that is, you know, when I came back the day after, it's the details are so jumbled up and the chronology was just all out of order, which is very common for people who experience something traumatic. That, you know, I just basically got down on my computer, sat down and just started typing everything I could remember. When I was preparing the book at close to 1 year, and I thought, well, this is a really good time to now put this out, because the 1 year anniversaries, you know, in my work with trauma folks, it can be very triggering. People don't really know how to spend an anniversary. And so I just wanted to see if there were people that had been hiding and avoiding for that whole year, if we could kind of get the word out. But my mom, who's my best friend, she's a brilliant writer and taught me how to write. And so she was kind of my editor, and she helped me read countless versions of this story and really helped me kind of get it down from like 10 single-spaced, you know, condensed, just dense pages to a pretty short story. So you should have seen it before with all the detail. It was very disjointed, and, you know, because this is a teaching tool, it was helpful to have my mom to say, you know, that extra detail doesn't really add to for the purpose of the book, you know. So she helped me kind of simplify and turn that into a very concise story. But having said that, I'm very happy that you could kind of get that vicarious experience to see, you know, even a glimpse of what that was like just by reading it. You know, I think you can summarize the whole night with 2 words: horrific and terrifying. That's probably the best way to describe it. And, you know, I mean, the important details are in there if people want to go and refer to that. I'm happy to tell you what happened. I'd say if I were to kind of summarize, you know, after the news clips sort of came out for that week or so, I think the whole story just kind of died, right? Very suspiciously, just died after a week. But there were these news stories that were, you know, just harping on 10 or 11 minutes of shooting, right? Which of course was not at all the experience that we had. You know, first of all, when people are in those kinds of experiences, whether it's rape or combat or natural disaster or child abuse, although that can be sometimes a prolonged experience, all of these types of traumatic events feel much longer than they are, right? And there are some very good reasons for that. It's almost like time kind of slows down. So, you know, I couldn't tell you how many minutes I thought it was going on, but it felt like much more than 10 minutes. The other thing is, it wasn't just simply a shooting that went on for 10 minutes. You know, we were at this concert, and by the time most people even realized that this wasn't fireworks and it wasn't confetti poppers and it wasn't part of the show, we were already into the second volley of gunfire, right? It really wasn't until the stage lights went off. Jason Aldean like grabbed his wife and ran because bullets started hitting the stage. That it was really not until the floodlights in the sort of the front portion of the venue, exactly where I was, on the Mandalay Bay side, up by the stage on all that turf area. It was standing room, right? Thankfully, the people who were in wheelchairs and with families and children were in the very back of the venue, which was closest to the exit. And I think most of them, just when the lights went on, they knew something was wrong, they exited and didn't experience what those of us in the front, because we kind of got stuck there, at least most of us. And so, you know, then there was the, 11 minutes of shooting, which of course, we had no idea, was it going to end? I just recall crouched down kind of at the edge of a plastic table behind a motorized wheelchair that had, I kept thinking, okay, it's got to have a steel back. Like, please don't hit my neck. Please don't hit my jugular. Please don't hit anything vital. And I was just waiting to get shot. I mean, the gunshots sounded like they were coming from different places. There were some that were very far off. There were some that were literally, I was expecting to see someone come over the fence. It was that close. And so, then there would be a volley, then there would be a break, then there would be a volley, then there would be a break. And, when there was finally a break that was a little bit longer, and of course that ended up being the end of the volleys, the end of the gunfire, some sort of secondary group of people that I had ended up stuck there with, we just decided to run, right? And I think the fascinating thing is that I don't have full memories of all of this, and that's very typical of people who experience trauma as well. But just to summarize, it was like 2.5 hours of running and hiding, right? So this 10 minutes of shooting didn't quite summarize what happened. The other interesting thing is everybody there had a completely different experience. Like, truly, depending on where you were and depending on whether you were shot, you were injured, somebody near you was shot, everybody had a completely unique experience. But, how do I know it was 2.5 hours? I was not checking my watch. All I know is the shooting started about 10. And by the time they herded us into a conference room, after running and hiding to multiple places around the strip, rolling under cars and running into one side of the building, running out because a mass of people, covered with dirt and blood and everything, are screaming, the shooters are coming, right? Then again, expecting to die. By the time I got into the conference room, I looked at my Fitbit and it was 12:30, right? And I was kind of shocked about that too, because I remember thinking, are we allowed to use profanity?
Yeah, no censorship necessary. Go right ahead.
I mean, I remember just thinking, holy shit, like 2.5 hours. What the fuck was going on for 2.5 hours? It just felt like longer than 10 minutes, but it felt like you have no sense of time, right? And then of course, once we were in the conference room for like 5 to 6 hours, we're all stuck in there freezing to death. And I mean, that was probably partly the shock of having gone through everything. And we're all in, it was beautiful weather in Vegas. We're all in not a lot of clothing, and we're in this super air conditioned room and scared to death. And we're getting text messages, bomb threats. They find bomb materials at the airport right next to where we were. I mean, it was a whole night. This wasn't just 10 minutes. And I think that people who weren't there and just hear about this incident, this massacre, just don't really have a way of understanding that. It wasn't just a moment of fear. It was an entire night and multiple moments of truly terror. And there are snapshots that I have through that night. And these were the moments that I truly thought this was it. That was the end. I was going to die. You know, the first moment was when we had, you know, decided, well, after the second volley, the lights went on, and me and a bunch of people that were around me went forward. The two girlfriends I was there with, they just disappeared. I mean, everybody got separated from who they were sitting right next to or standing right next to. And thankfully, I think before the shooting was even over, they made it back to the room, although not without injury, because one of my friends, in crawling over one of those food truck or grills, burned her leg badly. I mean, so, you know, there were all kinds of just random things. They said that when they were running off the venue, the girl right next to them got shot in the neck. And I keep thinking, you know, I kept thinking, holy cow, if I had followed them out, that could have been me that got shot. Because you know, they were a little younger than me. I tended to be the mama bear and like be behind everybody. And so, you know, we kind of moved towards the stage. I couldn't tell you like how far we moved, but we kind of went up to as close to the side of the stage, and we didn't know what was going on. All we knew is that something was coming from sort of the direction of the Mandalay Bay and the air, right? Or somewhere in, you know, coming not from like somebody next to you, for example.
Mm-hmm.
We couldn't see anything. And I remember being crouched down, just like it was yesterday, and really thinking that I was going to get shot, and just praying that it wasn't going to hit anything vital. That was, I mean, I was convinced that this was going to be it. And then, you know, there were moments of denial when I kept thinking that this is not happening. This cannot be happening. But then thinking, shit, this is happening. But this has to stop. At some point, it's got to be over. Either I'm going to die, we're going to all die, or it's just got to stop at some point. This can't go on forever. And then when there was that break and we started running, all I can recall, Nick, is taking a couple of steps and seeing just an enormous pool of blood. And that was the next moment when I thought, oh my God, I just had this thought, holy shit, people are really dying, right? It's like it was coming in and out of the realization that this was a life-threatening situation, right? But it's just so terrifying and horrific and unexpected and unpredictable that, you know, there's a part of your brain that's like, no, this cannot possibly be happening, right? People who've been through trauma understand this. At that point, something very interesting happened. And, you know, this kind of was a wonderful thing in a sense, because going through this experience myself, although it wasn't the first trauma I've had in my life, it was certainly the most recent and tangible. And of course, as a therapist now with expertise in trauma. And I really, then subsequently trying to help the community, I went and did a lot of research and found new ways to teach my patients about trauma and help people, you know, in the Route 91 survivor community, as well as other survivor communities for all kinds of traumas, just better understand why some of these things happen, right? And so the interesting thing that happened is, after that pool of blood, I just blocked out the next few seconds or minutes. I couldn't even tell you, because my memory is like pristine green turf. That's my memory. But a few weeks later, we saw a picture of what we were maneuvering over. And I specifically came back from Vegas using the word, yeah, I remember maneuvering. I was talking to somebody who was there with me, and he said, you know, do you remember what happened? And I said, you know, snapshots. I remember maneuvering off the turf. Well, I mean, it was pretty, that's just an understatement. It was incredibly disturbing to see this photo. And, you know, I looked at it a few times. I haven't looked at it since. It was, and I shared it with my mom at one point. She's just, you know, it gives you the EBGBs. It's just, the turf littered with body, beer cans, belongings, hats, shoes, garbage, everything. And so that was what we were maneuvering over. And, I remember almost tripping, and I remember cotton mouth, like I've never experienced in my life, right? Which is a very, very classic fight, flight, freeze response. It's one of those physiological symptoms when we're having that fear response. All animals experience these things. And the next thing I remember, very bizarre, right, is because of that cotton mouth, there was some guy behind the vending area in the mid venue throwing out bottles of water to people that were running. It was the most irrelevant random, but at the moment it wasn't irrelevant because I had cotton mouth. I couldn't breathe, right? And so any animal's first priority is to survive, right? But for example, that part of the experience then became a way, using my own personal example, to share and teach people why we remember certain pieces of a traumatic experience, but not the whole story typically, right? And it has to do with a protein that is released in the brain called the ARC protein, released by the hippocampus, which kind of is the roommate of your amygdala. It takes notes, and it's kind of noting like everything it's experiencing in the environment. Why? Just in case we're ever in this situation again, right? The animal mind wants to remember this. And so we believe that protein drives home any kind of memories, usually at the height of your hyperarousal, and those moments that you probably think you're going to die, and it sends it to long-term memory storage, right? And why is that significant? Because down the line, when you start having trauma symptoms, right, whether they go away, which most of the time they do and they resolve, or whether they stick around, that's what becomes the source of these intrusive images, these intrusive memories, these intrusive visuals, the flashbacks. That's what that comes from. And so explaining this again from a very intellectual, academic perspective helps people understand, oh, that's why I can't remember everything. And those snapshots are like driven into my brain, like nobody's business. Also explaining cognitive neuroscience. Why don't we remember certain things? Why, one thing that bothered me, Nick, was that to this day, I don't remember all the bodies, right? I remember seeing people being carried at the very beginning of the first few volleys, but I turned to one of my friends. I said, oh, they must be drunk and they're just carrying them. No, they were dead. But my brain couldn't connect that because I didn't have the information. But there's actually a really logical reason. Well, there are two possible explanations for why we don't remember everything. And cognitive neuroscience, which is fascinating and complex, explains this to us. In order for things to be stored in memory, we have to be able to attend to something. But also we have to be able to use language, and we have to label it, right? If you don't label something with human language, then it can't go into storage. So that's one problem, because if you think about it, the human brain can only focus on so much when you're in a life-threatening situation. So what do you think the human brain is going to focus on? What would you guess?
That the brain would focus on any relevant cues of danger.
Exactly. It will focus on things that are immediately relevant and necessary to the animal's survival. So if you take a step back, as just awful and repulsive as this sounds, are dead bodies necessary for my survival? Wow. Belongings, anything not moving, my brain is possibly not even going to label it, and then therefore not going to store it. So that's one possible explanation, but there's another one. When we are in a hyper-aroused state, it's almost as though we are now on the 10th floor of a building and we're storing memories at that hyper-aroused state, right? There's something in social psychology they talk a lot about called state-dependent learning. And it means that whatever state you're in when you're learning something, you will have better recall when you're in that state, right? And so of course you something like this, and then you come back down to the ground floor. And so when you try to look for those memories, you can't find them because they're stored on the 10th floor, right, in that file cabinet up there. And so sometimes people can get re-triggered when they have then again another life-threatening situation, what a fight, flight, freeze response is called when there is no lion, right? So, going through some of those experiences gave me a kind of a richer experience or a richer understanding of what a lot of my patients who've been through trauma experience, and a lot of new ways to explain it, because I found, in starting the support group for the Route 91 community, I found myself needing to find new ways to explain a lot of this science in lay terms. And I like to use a lot of analogies and stories to kind of bring it all together so that not only is learning fun, but the understanding sticks with people. Yeah. And so that was a lot of what I did. So back to what happened that night, after we then made it past that pool of blood and the maneuvering and all of the stuff I've blocked out to some extent, we ended up halfway back from the venue. We're still not at the exit. And we crawled over food trucks and just kind of waited there. And that was another pretty scary time because, we didn't know what was going to happen. No, we were cut off. We were just waiting for a police officer or somebody with authority. And finally, somebody did come and said, in very plain terms, get the fuck out, get the fuck out, get off the venue. And, we were the last group of people probably stuck on the venue, and we were herded, into this concourse with all these glass shopping shops, shopping stores or whatever. And it was like a moment to breathe, but Nick, that was another moment that I just was waiting to see shooters and waiting to die. We were crouched down. Then next thing you know, a mass of people running down the concourse, screaming bloody murder. So of course some of us followed suit and went back out onto the streets, and then I along with another group of people, including an off-duty LAPD officer, we rolled under trucks and whatever we could in the parking lot until more police came up to that area screaming, get back in the building. I mean, it was chaos, right? It was complete chaos and confusion, and it was terrifying. I think by the time I got in the room, Nick, in the conference room, I was like, fuck it. If it's my time, it's my time. I mean, like, we've been running and hiding for 2.5 hours. What am I going to do if this